Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch video, and today we're comparing some of the most important watches in the Rolex collection and in their history, and that is the Rolex Submariner 40mm versus the 41mm. As with all my reviews, let's go back in time now and take a look at the history of these two watches. They obviously share the same history, and I'm not going to look too in depth at the history of the Submariner. If you want to learn more about how the Submariner was brought into the collection, then go check out one of my more in-depth videos that looks more closely at the history. But for this one, we're just going to look at a more basic version. We're going to skip back now to 1953, which was when the Rolex Submariner was originally released. It was released as a dive watch, as a professional tool specifically for divers that were using it as a timekeeping tool underwater to keep track of how much oxygen was remaining in their oxygen tanks. And they did so by using the rotating bezel on the Submariner, and rotating the bezel around and using elapsed time essentially to work out how much time remained in their tanks. The watch was of course built to a very high standard and quite a rugged standard, so that it could withstand the 100 and then later on 200 and nowadays 300 meter water resistance that watch had. So the case itself was very solid and hard wearing, and that meant that a lot of people were buying this watch and wearing it from the general public, so non-divers. And those divers that were buying this watch were actually ended up wearing this piece just in everyday life too. And Rolex recognized this, so just over 10 years later in 1966 they released the 1680 or 1680 reference, and that was the first Submariner to feature a date function. Again, the date function was an addition to the Submariner collection or watch by Rolex as a recognition that a lot of people now that were wearing this watch, more people than were using it as a tool, like a dive tool, were actually using it in the office, at home, to take to the gym or just go swimming with. So the major audience of that piece was no longer a professional, or a professional diver, it was a professional of a different type. So the date function was added to make it more useful for day-to-day use. As a result of the introduction of the date window or the date function, the Rolex Submariner increased in popularity even more, and various models were released over the years in different precious metals, different steel and precious metal combos, and different dial options and colors, etc, etc. But the one that we're looking at today, or a model that we're interested, was released in 2010, and that was the 1166 series of Submariners, and that was the first time we saw the ceramic bezel. Actually, a couple years prior on the Smurf was when we first saw the ceramic bezel in 2008, but this was the first time we saw the steel line have a super case and this ceramic bezel look. So that's very close to what the watch we're looking at today. Obviously one of them is the one that we're looking at today, the 40mm, which was released in 2010. And then later, 10 years later in 2020, during lockdown and all the craziness of coronavirus, Rolex came out and surprised everyone by revamping the whole entire Submariner line and replacing every single model in the collection with a 41mm Submariner. So it was a pretty unusual and unpredictable decision from Rolex to do that. We're not really sure why they did that. We never saw it coming. I think a lot of people's kind of opinion at that time was, if it isn't broke, then why fix it? So why update the collection if it doesn't need to be fixed? But since then, the popularity of the 41mm has increased. It was met with a little bit of resistance at the time, understandably so, as it was the 40mm case size was the standard case size for the Submariner and had been for almost probably 60 or 70 years. Nowadays though, like I said, lots of people are really accepting that 41mm and finding it a really great piece. That concludes the history of these two watches. Let's take a look now at the features of these two models, and we're going to kind of compare each feature of each watch and just look at them and the differences between the two and which is necessarily better or preferable for a certain person. Starting as always with the clasp. The clasp of these two watches is the same. It's the same glide lock clasp, fantastic clasp, extremely solid, hard wearing, in almost all brushed finish, which does make it a bit of a scratch magnet, because if you scratch it across the grain, it really does show up. But it is better than a polished clasp like a GMT Master, which has a polished center link or polished center part of the clasp. But this is definitely better than that. It is quite a large clasp though, which does make it, again, more of a scratch magnet. It's easier to dink it or scratch it when it's that big, but it is really comfortable nonetheless. The glide lock function of the clasp is also extremely useful. The glide lock function was originally designed for divers that were using this watch so that they could wear the watch over the top of their wetsuit and then adjust the bracelet size or the clasp to make it smaller so that they could wear it over their bare wrist, during the day, normal day-to-day use, without having to take out links. So it was a really useful feature. Nowadays, people that own this watch aren't generally diving with it, so they're using this glide lock essentially in the summer or the winter when your wrist expands or contracts, to make sure that the watch fits a little bit tighter and better during those times where your wrist would contract or expand. So there's no real difference here in clasp. Moving on to our bracelet. The bracelets are different. They are both the Oyster bracelet in brushed finish with little tiny side polish finish on them. The brush finish makes it feel more kind of utilitarian. It makes it feel more like a tool or a utility watch, which is really nice. I like that about this watch. It is really beautifully machined and feels incredibly solid on your wrist. It will never wear out or stretch over time. It's just a fantastic bracelet. They are solid links, unlike the older Submariners that featured hollow links. The difference though in the bracelets here is just kind of small. It was just to size it up ready for that 41mm case size. They have increased the lug width on this bracelet on the 41mm versus the 40mm to 21mm versus the 20mm that we had on the previous generation. And they've also scaled up the kind of smallest part of the bracelet to 19mm versus the 18. So it's just scaled up by 1mm. You actually don't really notice it on the wrist. It feels really nice. So yeah, it's tiny adjustment here, nothing major. You won't notice it too much, but it's just so that everything is more proportional to the watch head. Moving on to our watch head. Now we will look at the movement first, what's inside. The movement was changed on the 41mm collection in 2020. We've got two new movements, the 3230 and the 3235. 3230 being for the no date version, so that's just available on one of the watches in the collection, and then the 3235 is for all the rest of the watches in the collection. Updates included a few different things, most notable being a 70-hour power reserve versus the 48-hour power reserve on the previous generation, the 40mm, which is a great addition because sometimes people will wear this watch as an everyday watch during the week, and then the weekend they might switch to something more dressy like a day date or a date just or something like that, or something from another brand. So the watch, the Submariner previous generation, was giving you 2 days power reserve. So if you put down the watch on Friday night or Friday afternoon, it would run out of charge or energy or be unwound by Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening. So it wasn't giving you a full weekend, whereas now this gives you an absolute full weekend. So you can comfortably put down that watch on Friday afternoon after work, put on your weekend watch, and then Monday morning your Submariner will still be going, which is really, really good. The new movement also received much tighter timekeeping tolerances as well. It's ±2 seconds a day, which is really, really strict, and which is brilliant because Rolex is already very reliable when it comes to timekeeping, and that makes them even more so. So definitely a welcome addition to the watch. Those couple adjustments to the movement. There were some other adjustments that were just slightly more minor, but all came to help build that extended power reserve and the greater accuracy of the watch. Moving on to our case now, this is obviously where we're going to see the biggest difference between these two watches. The cases weren't just, or the case on the 41mm wasn't just scaled up in the exact same proportions and shape that we saw in the 40mm. It's been slightly changed and redesigned to look slightly different to the 40mm, which is nice because it means the 41mm doesn't actually wear too big on your wrist. You don't notice it so much because they've altered certain design cues to make it feel more like a classic watch. It doesn't feel like just a big giant scaled up version. So not that 1mm extra would make it particularly giant, but yeah, it doesn't feel too overfacing. The lugs on this watch are probably where you're going to see the biggest difference between the 40mm and the 41mm. The 40mm obviously was released in 2010 with that super case size, which was famous for having big chunky wide lugs and quite a deep case design versus previous generations. This 41mm version, the 1266 series, has gone back to the kind of more slender, elegant, longer lugs that we see on previous generations, like the 166 series, or even prior to that, like the vintage Submariners, like the 1680 and the 5513. So some say that this new 41mm is more reminiscent of a vintage Submariner, or the older collections are truer to the first series of Submariners, which is really nice. I can definitely see why people think that. So definitely a welcome design change there. I think that looks really lovely. It sits on your wrist really beautifully and kind of is slightly more like a classic dress watch, like a Day or a Date Just, sorry, rather than the more sporty watches. It's just lending itself more towards an elegant piece now, which I think is really lovely. The crown guards on the side of the watch as well are slightly scaled down. They're slightly smaller and thinner, again creating that slightly more elegant and refined look to this Submariner. The depth hasn't increased proportionally to the increase of diameter, and so they haven't increased the depth to accommodate or to make the watch feel the same depth as the 40mm was. They've kept the same depth, which means this watch wears much flatter to your wrist, doesn't seem as chunky as the old version, and paired with those lugs, the reduced or same depth, bigger case size, means this watch definitely feels more like a more elegant timepiece. The 40mm overall just feels more squat on your wrist, more chunky and bold, versus the 41, which has a little bit more of a classic feel. Again, we're literally talking about 1mm difference in case size here. So the case size is very, very minimal. Where you will notice the difference between these two watches is in their design changes, like the lugs and the crown guards, etc., etc. Moving on to our dials now, we've got one minor change on the dial. The dials obviously are slightly different sizes, the 41mm being slightly scaled up to accommodate for the larger case, which makes this watch arguably more legible, but very, very minor differences here. We've got a really legible dial already, being a black lacquer dial with white, large maxi lume markers on them. So really easy to read anyway, but we've got some small changes, and that is down at 6 o'clock, where it used to say Swiss made. On the 40mm, we now have it slightly different positioned, and we've got in between Swiss and made, we've got the Rolex crown logo in between, so we now have two crown logos on the actual watch dial. Kind of nothing to be excited about. Very, very minor change here. Obviously, no one's going to really care or notice too much. That concludes the features of these two watches. Let's take a look now at whether or not I'd own them and what I think, who would suit each of one of these watches, who's going to continue to buy these watches. Overall, both of them are fantastic watches. The change between these two watches is minimal. It's just a tiny, tiny increment. That's the really nice thing about Rolex, is they don't really change their designs too much. No watch will ever become extinct in their collection. Purists probably will prefer the 40mm over the 41. However, you may find that some purists will actually really like the 41 because it is slightly more reminiscent with those thinner lugs of the vintage Submariners and the original Submariners out there, or the versions previous to the 1166 series, so the 2010 series. But yeah, I think everyone will find their preference with these two watches. It just depends on which design you like more rather than which case size you like more, because the case change in size is so minor, it's barely noticeable. One thing to note though is you do definitely feel the difference in the case sizes when you've gone from one to the other. For example, when you put on the 41mm for the first time, you can feel it's slightly bigger, but not too much. It's barely noticeable at all. If you're moving from a 40 to a 41, you really won't really notice it too much. and you get used to it probably within a day, if that, maybe a few hours, you get used to that slightly larger size. But when you go back to the 40mm or see a 40mm, it almost feels wrong. It almost feels squished and squat on your wrist. The design almost feels too deep and wide as well in terms of the lugs. It kind of feels square on your wrist almost. So I think the difference you'd notice these watches is if you got used to the 41 and then went back to a 40, you'd really notice it more. But the difference between these two pieces is not particularly big. We're really splitting hairs here. I think I can liken it though a little bit, just from personal experience of trying both these watches on and wearing both these watches, is when everyone made or almost everyone made the transition from an iPhone 4 or 5 to an iPhone 6, when we went from that slightly smaller screen size to the bigger 6 size. When they released the 6, everyone met that change with such resistance and kind of hate, as if to saying, I will never buy that phone, it's way too big. But then eventually everyone bought that phone, and I'm sure everyone will remember the moment when perhaps you were setting up that phone and got used to it for a couple hours or a day even. I mean, I'd say for me, a couple hours, you go back to your iPhone 4 or 5 to check something and it feels so small, you almost think to yourself, how the hell could I survive with this phone all those years? I think that's in a more extreme version than these Submariners here, but I can definitely say that this situation here is a slightly diluted version of that, and but still kind of similar in the way that if you got used to a 41, which you definitely could go from a 40, because the transition is not too major, you'd almost feel it's strange to go back to the 40. It would almost feel a bit weird to put that one back on again. But nonetheless, great watches overall. Both of them are really steady investment pieces as well. The 41mm is doing brilliantly in terms of investments, going up in value lots and lots and lots, following the rest of the collection. But the 40mm is always going to remain such a solid investment timepiece and has so many years history to prove itself as one of the best investment options you can buy from Rolex. If it was me choosing today, I probably would choose the 40mm because I prefer the older case size. I like that 40mm case size personally. I love the design of that watch as well. I like the super case personally. I think it makes it look more sporty and more like a tool or like a Submariner, a dive watch. But I do definitely really love the elegance of that 41. I think if they made that 41 case design with the thinner lugs in 40mm case size, it would be my dream watch. But yeah, fantastic watches, both of them. You can't go wrong with either. My personal preference is the older 40mm, sorry. Let us know in the comments which of the two you prefer. Let us know what other comparison videos you'd like us to make. And as always, if you're interested in either of these watches featured in this video, then don't hesitate to contact us. Our details are in the description. And also at the end of the video, it would be a pleasure to call either one of these watches into stock for you.